Welcome to the CMS panel, and thank you all for choosing this session over all the other available options. I know it can be hard to choose, but I think you've made a good choice. My name's Abby Kingman. I'm moderating. I am a project manager at Last Call Media. This is my first Nerd Summit ever, and it's also my first time moderating a panel. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to learn a lot, and I think everyone in the room will learn a lot too. We have some fabulous group of panelists, and I will give some brief introductions. And as I go along, I will ask each of you to tell us a little bit about yourselves. We'd love to know your whole life story, but what I'd like you to do just for today is to just introduce yourself and sort of give us the Twitter version of your technology path to your current relationship with CMS technology specifically. Jen is a co-founder of Backdrop CMS, former and current Drupal developer, lead organizer for the largest Drupal camp in the world, Badcamp, former Twig initiative lead for Drupal 8, formerly the director of Drupal training at Chapter 3, and customizing, tweaking, and hacking website templates since 1997. Your Twitter elevator pitch.
So I got started working in content management systems back in about 2005, I'd guess, by writing my own. And then I learned that I'm not as good at it as everyone else in the world, and I should use open source software. So here I am.
Great. All right, thank you. Al Nutile.
Wow, impressive. I'm the last name. You did a good job.
I got coached. Former Drupal CMS developer and shop owner, now provides CMS solutions in a company that has gone all Drupal for their 400 plus CMS related sites, and then Laravel Angular for internal applications. Sorry.
Oh yeah. So I for a number of years did Drupal and then had my own shop and all that, and about 2 years ago moved away from it and been doing Laravel work for a company that they have a lot of Drupal sites, but they realized there was some strength in using a different technology for their APIs and more dynamic JavaScript-like applications for internal applications. So that's where I'm at now.
Great. Nathan Kirschbaum. Nathan specializes in application architecture and development using open source tools like Laravel, Angular, JavaScript, and Drupal. In recent years, Nathan has worked on projects such as Jack Daniels, Harvard Medical Schools, MIT, I'm not going to try that one, and many others. Nathan's also a co-host of Developers Hangout, a weekly podcast.
Yeah, that was pretty good. The other thing I have a little bit of experience with in terms of the CMS category would be WordPress and Drupal. I wouldn't consider myself, or sorry, not WordPress and Drupal, WordPress and Magento. I wouldn't consider myself to be an expert, but I do have enough background there as well to make some conclusions or have some opinions on that. And I did Drupal kind of technical project management and then development for many years, and then recently kind of got more into other things and building larger applications and using modern object-oriented PHP as it's really just coming to fruition over the last few years, really significant changes. So that's me.
Great, thanks. Greg Perham? Is that right? Perham, sorry. Greg is a freelance website developer and hosting provider specializing in custom WordPress site. Began working independently in 2011 with the business name Swing Graphics, and customizing, tweaking, and hacking website templates since LiveJournal in 2003.
And how I got started with WordPress was 4 years ago. A graphic design agency said, "Can you build a WordPress site for us?" And I said, "Yes," and learned from there.
Joe Bacal?
Bacal. Yeah.
Bacal. I only got one right out of all those, okay.
That's right.
Joe is the applications administrator at Smith College, where he manages and develops Moodle and WordPress applications. He has experience building small and medium CMS systems in WordPress, and also teaches Scratch and front-end web dev to kids and families with Holyoke codes. So
That's true.
Your journey?
Yeah, so my journey is I will nominate myself most junior developer on the panel.
Nice.
So I was a teacher for many years, and then but all through those years was a procrastinator in the form of playing with my computer, and I spent most of my time like automating my gradebook instead of actually correcting things. I would make database applications, and it was ridiculous. So I just said, I wish I could just be doing this. This is the part I like. So I got into web development little by little, and then I started in WordPress at my old company at Common Media. We had a WordPress developer who was super pro, and he left, and I said, I'll do it. And then I, like you, just kind of learned over the last couple of, last year and a half.
Great.
And I'm into Common Media. Yeah, I'm into Nutile.
Great, thanks. So clearly we have quite a few topics that we can talk about with this panel. We've got Backdrop, Drupal, WordPress, Laravel, Angular, Magento. We'd also like to touch a little bit on the pros and cons of using a CMS and when a CMS is appropriate and when it's not. So we do have a few questions queued up, and I'd like to go through each question, give each person a chance to speak about it a little bit, and then have some questions from the audience. So for the first question, what is a CMS? If Nate, maybe you could take that question,
Sure.
And then we can pass it down the line.
Yeah, this is actually a good, kind of an interesting and good question, because I think people get tripped up on this a lot. And I think CMS is used in a way that is actually has caused quite a bit of pain and suffering for a lot of us out there. And that is, I think that, one of the first obviously the first and most popular, I don't know if it's the first actually, but the most popular CMS out there is WordPress. That's just pure numbers there. In WordPress, you get something where, and it's of course changed over time, but this still holds true, where you get something out of the box that is shiny and polished, and almost anyone could use it. You can do really complicated things with it. You can do almost anything with it, which is actually true of most things we're going to talk about here. But for the average non-technical user, it is just so easy. And in my mind, that is a CMS, right? And so one thing that I talk about a lot is I actually don't think Drupal, I don't think it does Drupal in particular any justice to call it a CMS. I think Drupal is a framework that you that you use to build CMSs. So you come and maybe you don't need a blog, maybe you need something else for your business, and you do the research and you do the due diligence and you figure out what your CMS should do, and then you build it. And I feel like there's been a lot of frustration over the years, just in my working with things, where if you look at a CMS as something that's just like operational that everyday users can use, that's what I think the general public view a CMS as. Whereas calling Magento a CMS or calling Drupal a CMS, in my mind, is pretty darn misleading, because you have to be, even if you're not a developer, actually, I didn't start out as a developer. It took me many years to master a Drupal in just the configuration and understanding the best practices and how things are put together without even touching a line of code. So that's, I think that's important to think about for me, are all CMSs, or what everyone calls a CMS, are they all really, is that useful? Is it useful to categorize them all that way?
Al, your thoughts?
Those are some interesting points. I agree. It is a funny term, content management system, CMS, in that it can really mean, hey, I need a blog, a title, and a body, versus I need revision and workflows and everything else. So in this case, it is kind of a simplistic acronym to describe all these different use cases. So something to keep in mind as we go. But I agree with a lot of what you said. Oh yeah, you already have one. Jeez.
Maybe.
I actually disagree with what you said. I think that WordPress doesn't qualify as a content management system. I think things that are more complicated and less intuitive do. And for me, that's because the definition of a content management system isn't so much about the usability, which I think is very important, obviously, but it's about what people need to do with their content. And for me, like, a content management system inherently has many different types of people who are doing many different types of things with many different types of content. And because WordPress, I have classified as a blog engine, is intended for one person to manage one type of content, or two, and now more. That's too simple a model for me for what I would call a content management system. I would expect there to be at least 2 administrators, which is what Drupal is intended for, where there's a high-level person who needs to know how it works, and then a person who just enters content, and any number of people in between. So you can have like a manager who manages the people who enter content, and an administrator who manages configuration as well as people, and then you have like your developer who needs to be in there too, but at a completely different level. And so for me, it's not the content or the tool so much as the people that define the content management system.
And we can have a chain of disagreements.
Yeah, sounds fabulous.
So there's a whole movement in the WordPress world. If you Google WordPress as a CMS, you'll get 1 billion hits and you'll get 1 billion links to blog posts and WordCamp presentations that all circle around this idea of trying to prove to the world that WordPress is a CMS. And then I think Matt Mullenweg takes it too far and wants to call it an operating system, and I think that's just wrong. But I guess I don't know enough technically about it, but I do know that as far as like having done a little bit of Drupal and then a lot of WordPress, a lot of the stuff that you want to do in Drupal where you're breaking up like the world into content types, and these content types have these relationships to each other, and that's kind of the fun of it. I found that you can do that in WordPress too, and I know that Drupal is built to do it, whereas WordPress you're sort of glomming it on. And then there's the technical stuff beneath it, which you can we can get lost in.
Yeah, you can also make Drupal do the stuff WordPress is good at, but like that's hard, and same thing for trying to make WordPress do the stuff Drupal's good at. So,
Does WordPress have the user roles?
Yeah.
But it's glommed on.
Yeah, but you could say that about Drupal. CCK is glommed on. Like
But
anytime
it's
things
not
got
anymore.
But that's
No, but so just like
It's glommed in now.
yeah.
well, WordPress has 5 roles that are in core.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I
And-
mean. So now they're in core. is what
Yeah,
you're saying.
yeah. 5 roles are in core, and then there's more. There's always a plugin for it, or you can write a plugin for it.
Yeah. Okay.
Interesting.
That's fair.
Great. Different
I also need to
perspectives.
say I don't know anything about WordPress, so.
Yeah.
But it's an
I
interesting.
only know a
Full
little bit
disclosure.
about this.
But it's an interesting definition that your view of the CMS is like it really includes helping with the workflows, the roles, and
Yeah.
everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good.
We're still on just what is.
I know. Yeah.
I think a CMS is anything that lets you create some content in one interface and put it somewhere else. So that could be, an endpoint for an API, which is now being built onto WordPress and Drupal, as I have learned. I thought actually Drupal had that already, but
No.
You can glom it on though.
right.
Yeah. Even
Is
that
that a
doesn't
technical term?
qualify.
Glomming it on.
Really difficult.
Like the first pseudo CMS that I had experience with was the best ever GeoCities site, which was mine. Thank you. Where I had a really simple interface for entering images. Like I had a folder of images, and I would just copy and paste. Because there was no file management, I had to manually input the names of those files, but it would then just take JavaScript to output those in a table, because this was 1999. Output those in a table and make a gallery out of it. And so I had, it was a pseudo CMS because it wasn't the greatest interface for entering that content, but it put it in one way and output it in a different way.
I have a question. What about like inline editing? Does that qualify as a separate interface?
So
Yes, because and maybe saying where it's stored is separate
Okay.
from the way it's output.
But would a WYSIWYG make the CMS more CMS, or would that be one of your requirements, Jen? Like for CMS?
It would make it more user friendly.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I don't think it makes it more CMS-y.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if it made it less CMS-y, but it sounds like no.
Either way,
I think the storage is what's maybe
Yeah.
what's important. Yeah, and it doesn't even have to be a database, because it could just be
Right.
files.
Files.
Yeah.
Well, this is interesting. So since we have such a broad range of disagreement about what a CMS is, the next 2 questions are going to be really good. As far as when is the CMS needed and when is it really not needed or might be a bad thing to use. So given the sort of diversity of thought from the first question, I think what I'd like to do is sort of roll those into one question and let people sort of answer their preferred version and explain why. So if you would like to give an example of a good case when a CMS is needed, or maybe a case when you think a CMS is not needed and might be a bad thing. Again, we'll start with Nate.
So, I mean, I guess in the kind of most liberal definition of CMS, it's really needed anytime there's an expectation that someone's going to log in and manage content, and just be an end user that uses the product in a non-technical way, meaning you don't need to push any code, you don't need to be any special kind of user, you're just an everyday user who has certain permissions and can log in and do stuff. So obviously the use case to not having a CMS would be you're writing an application that all it does is talk to other applications, and no one's logging into that, no one's doing anything. It's just communicating back and forth via whatever methods it uses, JSON or whatever. So yeah, I think in terms of when you should use so here's the thing, you can build a CMS with any of these tools. So no matter what our definitions of a CMS were, we can all use the tools we just talked about to give you what you think is a CMS, no matter what we think it is, right? And so the question is, as someone who's thinking of or requesting a CMS, or someone who's building someone else a CMS, how do you decide what tool to use to do it? And that's where it gets interesting to me, because I can tell you that, and I started working with Laravel recently, which is a lot friendlier and easier to use than Symfony, but not friendly like non-technical users are going to use it. It can get complicated. They try to make it easy, but it can get complicated. And it's all based on Symfony stuff anyway. But I could tell you that I could configure a new blog on an existing Laravel site just as quick as any Drupal developer could configure and theme a new blog on their site. And so the question then becomes, what resources do you have? Who are you? Because I can tell you, if you're not a developer, if you're not familiar with source control, you're not going to want to do it in Laravel, because there's no getting in the database and it's all in code. So I think that's an important thing too. If you're someone who doesn't have a development team, isn't a developer, isn't interested in investing in a developer or a development team or a big company, I would almost always recommend Drupal or a tool that really fits that, because you actually are going to have to invest a lot of time and energy into learning it yourself, but it's very achievable in my mind. You're not going to have to quit. You're not going to have to quit your job and study for 6 months of your life to even understand the fundamentals of how to do this thing, which you might have to do if you're using Symfony or something else. So,
the one thing I would say overall is typically a site never does one thing, right? So a person comes to you and says, "I want you to build me this." One thing I would consider is is 10% of this a CMS, they're posting something, and the other 90% is a complex application? Then you have to make decisions like that too. And I think sometimes the frustrations I had with these other platforms was that it's we're building a project for a client, and really it's not a CMS. They don't really care about messing with views. They maybe want to not have a complex workflow, but the other things they want to do were too complex for that CMS. And so I think when not to use a CMS isn't as easy of an answer to a question. It depends on the project of how much of it is a CMS, and if it's a very little amount, then you might want to think about using a CMS-like plugin for that particular framework you could use, right? Or using them combined, because in a lot of these things you can share database type communications or API type communications. So you can get the best out of Drupal's workflows, but also you can get the strengths of these other things that do APIs like Laravel. So that was always my struggle. It's not everything is just a CMS. It's typically doing a bunch of things. So something to keep in mind was, you don't need this. Something that always came up for me.
So I also, you probably all have friends too that say, "Oh, I need a website. Can you help me?" And you're like, "Well, let's talk about what you mean by website," because most of my friends do not need a content management system. They need a Squarespace site, right?
Yeah,
something that they can administer themselves, but they don't need any maintenance. They can get it for free, right? They don't need me. And they don't know they don't need me, which is why they ask me for it. But once I tell them about Squarespace, they very quickly realize they don't need me.
I love that.
But there is often this thing where like everybody needs a website, but not everybody needs a really complicated tool to manage it, because what a website is different to everyone. And sometimes it's a 5-page brochure site, and they can get that responsive on Squarespace for free. Sometimes what they need is very complicated, and it requires crazy internal calculations or relational data or whatever. And then you start getting into who's on your team, which I think is exactly the right next question. Because if you have a bunch of people in your office who have been managing HTML files for years, and now they want something more sophisticated, like you might be able to build them a tool that they can continue to manage in HTML and push with Git and publish blog posts that way. And that might be a much better tool for them than a content management system that requires a whole bunch of new skills that they may not have. But then if you have something that requires like pulling in data from other sources and API interaction, and you already have tools that meet a bunch of those needs that exist for some other product, then it might start making sense where it's like, oh, well, you're aggregating this thing from here and this thing from here and this thing from here, and there's 15 Drupal modules that do all those things, and you get that for free. Maybe that becomes more attractive to them. Then at the same time, you're like, then you have to build this thing and maintain this thing, and if you don't have anyone who knows that, but you have a guy in your office who knows WordPress, like maybe you should do that instead. So I do think it's about what do you mean by website, which is always really hard to get to the bottom of, but then also who do you have to work on it, and are you interested in using your internal resources, hiring a contractor, or getting on board with some company with a permanent relationship to maintain your custom code or whatever you need.
Nope.
I don't have too much to add. I think that, like, for one thing that comes to mind is Squarespace. So for the friend wants a website, obviously that friend, like, the first question is like, well, do you want it to look exactly the way you want it to look, or do you want it to just look nice? And if you want it to just look nice, yeah, much faster just make Squarespace site. But even with Squarespace, because there's actually a whole sort of API for it. It's not really an API, but you can like push to it with Git, and you can make a theme or they call it a template. But you can actually start to hack it a little bit. You can't actually do the back end of it, but you can actually start to make it like a content management system. And I sort of started on Squarespace years ago and watched it kind of evolve, and it borrows the language of WordPress and the way people think about what their content is, and it kind of maps that onto the Squarespace thing. So there's a degree to which like websites copy each other, and they all tend to have a thing where it's like there's a repeating type of content, and that it becomes a view or whatever. So, I mean, and then I'm going to steal what Rick said when I was talking to him earlier. Like, we were saying, well, when do you not need a CMS? Like, what's the point of not, like, why would you, like, does anybody have a hard-coded HTML site anymore?
Yeah.
I actually know of one, but but it seems like it's, like, would be silly not to have.
No.
Think about this.
Okay, how many people in the room know someone who has or know someone who has? Yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think, but to come back to that point, it's like, my site is both dynamic and I have 4 or 5 static pages.
Yeah.
I love that I can open up a page and say, this is HTML, and I can touch and play and change it. WordPress allows that.
That's what I was going to say.
Drupal, not that you're representing Drupal wherever you are, it would be harder for me to get in there and say, this is how I want my page to be, So I think it's, again, the balance, like, is it really a CMS when most of my site is actually static?
You could throw a static HTML site where your Drupal, and it would be just fine.
Yeah.
And then I tell you that this has happened before, and then because it's actually quicker, quicker meaning quicker to put together, quicker to put together. It'll also be quicker in terms of performance, but then you'll lose like all the, like you basically by doing that strip out all the functionality of Drupal. So your client later on is going to be like, oh hey, I want to do this with this module, and you're going to be like, yeah, well, we didn't do things the normal way in Drupal, so now your site doesn't work like a normal Drupal site. Yeah, it gets messy.
There's another.
Oh, go ahead.
There's just another scenario where, like, if you're dealing with like certain politics of certain IT groups. That
Oh, hang on a second. We're going to get you on the microphone.
where like there's just if you're dealing with like the politics of certain IT groups, like in larger organizations.
They have politics?
And then there's like even like debate about what CMS to use, but there's also a deadline
Yeah.
and the site doesn't require updating more than once ever.
And what modules you can use.
Well-
No limit you
well,
there,
that too.
Yeah.
Even
Well-
assuming you know the CMS, and there's
Yeah.
even that question of what modules to use.
Yeah.
There's scenarios where it's like, we just need this thing, it's like a view book for a college, and we need to
Yeah.
do this in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And there's just no overhead in the budget or administrative willpower to make the CMS decision on time. You hack out a static site and it's okay.
Yeah.
That's another, that happens more often for us than you'd think. I mean, it's certainly not a question of like chops or whatever. It's like just pure
Well,
politics.
static sites are the trend right now.
Well, that's-
Jekyll, yeah. No, I was going to bring up security in deployment. When you don't want a CMS is if you have to deploy the thing, because it's a pain. And you guys, there's solutions, but those solutions are like PhD level, complicated solutions.
Push a button.
On a service called Pantheon. Right? It's like, you know, you guide a friend to Pantheon and they're gonna be like, what? You know, it's
Pantheon
not.
is a developer tool.
Exactly,
I was talking
so-
about the user interface where you push the button.
All right,
Yeah.
so.
Okay, but security updates too, that's the other one too. They have to
Okay.
do that. But we still are missing.
Yeah, just to finish
Yeah.
through, Leah, how about Craig?
In a certain respect, I think it's more a question of when is which CMS appropriate versus, you know,
When is a CMS needed or not?
When,
Yeah.
when is a CMS a bad thing? Because it almost never. I mean, Chris, the point that you brought up is good. Just like, yeah, I mean, I have recently built some websites without a CMS because even if it's WordPress, like it's still, there's some more overhead and cost. And if the client, so I'm not saying necessarily what I think, but what I have done is when the client says we don't care about editing it, and we just want it as quick and as cheaply as possible, then I will reluctantly build them a static site because I'm just going to be the one making edits. A new gallery next year or something, you know, that's really
Maybe
it.
you'll build your own CMS for when they ask for changes.
Right, yeah.
You'd at
That's
least
when we
like,
make the conversion to
500
CMS.
hours.
yeah, I would at least want PHP to do includes, like, especially, depends on how big it is. I guess if it's a 2-page site, sure. But if it's like a
Right, so
20-page
that's-
site, I'd want
That's what
includes.
I've done, yeah,
Yeah.
it's just like, you
I've
just use
done that
includes.
before, where somebody asked me for a website and I'm like, oh, I can build that for you in Drupal in like 6 hours. And then I finished it. And then 2 years later, they were like, do I still have that website? And like never even, and I was like, okay. And they're like, could you update it for me? And so I was like, fine, file, save page as, static HTML, throw out the Drupal site, make changes.
That's good.
There you go.
One page. I was like, why did I do this?
Well, that's almost a perfect segue to the last question, which is to describe a use case that a CMS or non-CMS that you often work in is best suited for. So that would be a great case for a non-CMS being best suited for. But I guess probably each person on the panel has an environment that you might favor. So if you could talk a little bit about why you might make a pitch for using that CMS or non-CMS. And just describe why you think that tool would perform better than the others under this certain use case. So let's start with Greg this time.
I was actually going to recommend that because I think if we go this way, we build from, like, the more do-it-yourself and to the really super custom, needs lots of intricate pieces, you know, way of looking at it. I think Squarespace, I edit people's sites who have Squarespace. Something like that, or WordPress.com for that matter, is great when you don't need to do anything custom. You're just like, hey, that looks great. You know, this was already mentioned, that's fine, $8 a month. I think WordPress is great when you're still willing to pay $8 a month or like $10 a month to have somebody do just bare bones maintenance for you every month. And you want to have that same simplified content entry experience where you can just plug some stuff into 1 or 2 fields, check a couple boxes for categories, and that's it. And you needed to do some custom stuff. And that can be anything from your 5-page site where you want to bring in bring something into a sidebar that's on somewhere else, to a medium-sized site of, I would even say like 50 pages is 50 or 100 pages is medium, where you need a couple different types of content, but not incredibly granular content.
Great. Joe?
It's when would we use it?
Yeah, so give a use case for a certain CMS, or if you prefer not a CMS, that
I mean,
for your
wanna
preferred
sell-
environment.
If it's your
make it-
friend, just put them on Squarespace. If it's
Someone with lots of money.
right? Yeah, build them up. I mean, I think that somebody said something about this before. It's like it depends who you are and who your team is. Like if someone said, "Hey, we need this functionality," I might think to myself, "Well, I'm sure that like you would do it much faster in Drupal, but I couldn't do it in Drupal, so I would do it in WordPress, and that would be fun." But otherwise, I don't think that if a person really doesn't need it to look exactly how they want it, or they don't have some kind of data situation of things that have to relate to each other, then just make a Squarespace site. That's what I say. Or Weebly or any of those.
See, I was anticipating that people would have like these strong felt allegiances to a particular technology, and I'm finding that that's not so much really the case. But
We all agree, don't do it for your friend. You can avoid that. You'll never be off the hook.
I'll confess to, for example, not a friend, a referral for a freelance job. They wanted a website and they had like a zero budget and they're already on GoDaddy. They're like, "Well, I was looking at the GoDaddy site builder. Could you just do that?" And I was like, "Well, I won't tell any of my friends, but now I'm up here on the panel. I did it."
oh wow! I'm going to tweet that right after this session.
Yeah.
And actually, that thing is horrible. What it actually does, you like input the data and actually like builds the entire page in JavaScript.
Wow.
Like the entire theme gets like, I think gets like created in JavaScript on the fly. I think it's a horrible idea. But yeah, it was fast.
We'll keep that here.
I will not reveal the URL.
Jen?
I would say if you have complex relational data, it's a really good time to choose Drupal or Backdrop, because it's really good at taking two things and relating them together and then contextually displaying information about one thing on the other thing, or vice versa. And you can have like many levels of relationships, where you could have like a blog post by an author who wrote a book and you can put all the book information like on the blog. Like there's just ways that you can tie stuff together. And especially if you need to be able to search on like all those little bits of data 4 steps away, Drupal's really good at pulling in all those relationships and giving you ways to get at all of that. I think if you want a basic blog, Drupal's not the right tool. It's not a good enough user interface, and it is way too much architecture for that. I think Backdrop's a little better, but still probably too much engine. I think if you have relational data, that's where that really wins.
Do we have a question back there too, by the way?
Oh, well, I was just sort of suggesting, like, the question to me,
Like the question that I always run into as working at a Drupal shop is,
Why is everything Drupal?
well, so like we're not going to do anything that's not Drupal.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, we get a lot of projects because they're already on Drupal. The interesting question to me is, when a project comes to me, when do I say we're not going to do that because it really shouldn't be done in Drupal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if somebody comes to us and say, hey, we've got $100,000, we want to build a blog, and we really want it in Drupal, like, are we going to say no to that?
Or something else, like they want to build something that's not Drupal. Like one company wanted me to build an API and they wanted me to use Drupal, and it was just fighting me all the way and totally was against the grain of what they wanted, right? And so you have to...
Right, so I mean, right, so I guess it's this question of where are the lines, not just like for you personally, but, or not for the technology, but it's like you either personally or like your skill set and or your company's skill set,
Right.
or even like as a company, we might be able to do some non-Drupal thing better, but that's like, we don't market ourselves that way, and we want to focus on doing Drupal projects because we don't want to like spin up a bunch of knowledge about some set of tools that then we never use again. So I mean, I was just thinking, since there was like a lot of answers that maybe were sort of like I'm not sure what the answer is. Like maybe the interesting question I would like to hear is, Like, when's the last time you gave away a project because it didn't fit into, you know, the set of tools that you normally use? If you've ever done that before.
Well, there's a couple of different things too. Like I feel like in the Drupal world right now, there's so many people who need work that pretty much everyone can kind of have their choice of what kind of work they want to do. And some companies will love to build that $100,000 blog in Drupal. Right. They would be like, sure, we'll take the money and build you a really fancy shiny blog. And then, you know, they'll spend all the time working on the user interface and stuff, and that's fine. I know for me, like, people come to me with requests of certain types of projects that could be done in Drupal, but I don't want to do it. And so I can just say no because that doesn't sound like fun. Like, I built this, you know, Drupal commerce site a couple of years ago, and then everybody's like, oh, you do Drupal commerce, can you do another one? And I'm like, I don't want to do another one. That was not a lot of fun for me. And it was the kind of thing where it's like, yeah, I have this website, I understand how to do, I could do it, but I don't want to. And there are so many companies that like specialize in like Drupal and commerce, and like, there's, go find one of them. They love this stuff. Like, I don't want to think about it anymore. And so I feel like we're really fortunate being able to make those decisions. And I feel like that's almost more important than like when you turn away a project because it's not what Drupal should do. Maybe it's because it's not what you should do is more important. I feel like I've personally turned away projects that if they are particularly like, oh, I need an API for something, and can you build that in Drupal? And I'm like, well, can, but probably don't really need that. And if it's a person that I have a relationship with and I want them to get the best thing for what they want, I'll try and refer them to like the right people for the job rather than me where it's like, oh, you know I built you a Drupal site 4 years ago and that's why you're coming to me now, but this is not what you want. You should talk to these people who are really good at exactly what you want, and hopefully that'll steer them in the right direction. But there are plenty of companies that have like standardized on Drupal and they know that that's what they want, even though that's maybe not what they need. And if you don't do it for them, someone else will. And if they're your client already, sometimes companies will just say, well, we'll just do it because if we lose this project, then we're going to lose our other projects with them. And, you know, they want to have, I don't know. There's plenty of reasons to do things you shouldn't do that maybe don't have anything to do with whether you should do them or not.
It's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, were you going to say something? Because I'll jump in.
Go ahead.
I can have a turn.
Yeah.
So the thing is, in your situation, you cannot say no, right? Your boss is like, whatever. You can't say no, right?
No, I mean,
In many situations, you can't, though. You really think you would say no to that $100,000 job because you didn't think it fit Drupal perfect?
it's complicated.
Okay, so let me answer it this way. Let me say this about Drupal. I think people forget Drupal is more of a, it can be just as much as a framework as it can be a CMS. And if you really step away for a moment and say, I don't need module X, Y, and Z to do 80% of what they need because the next 20% is going to be just as expensive, take a moment and learn Drupal's API and build it yourself. Build a because if you think about the views module, that's because Sony said, Drupal's not doing it for us. We're going to make this guy build this module for our needs. So if you step back and put on your developer hat and say, I'm going to build something using Drupal at the core level, using its APIs and its framework type workflow, you can make something very specific for that client that works just for them and get all the benefit of Drupal from the user access system to its revision systems or whatever else it might be offering you at that moment in that project. So if you really are needing to put Drupal into a certain spot you're not comfortable with, there's a lot you can do with it at that coding level really, really nicely.
All right, so I'd like to, since we're coming close to our end, I'd like to hear Nate get a chance to respond to this topic, and then open up for more questions from the audience.
Yeah, we can basically get right to questions. I mean, I think it boils down to like the right tool for the right job, and it's just there's so many things that go into that. It's actually, I mean, it's an academic debate. Like, you know, I could make criticisms all day long of using Drupal as an API because it loads all the modules. Because if people don't do it right or don't do the right hack, it actually loads the theme layer when you don't even need the theme layer. Whatever. But the bottom line is, you could throw that on a big server and no one's ever going to know. It's you know, in your use case, it might not make a difference, and it's really just about the right tools and the right job and what you have.
So I have to say that as I'm probably one of the least technical people in the room just listening to all of this, and I feel like what I've learned is that the whole CMS topic isn't really just about code, it's more of an ecosystem that is code and people, and there's a lot of really and it's the people on every side of the equation that really influence the decision. So that's been a really fascinating discussion. Any questions from the
I have
audience?
a question.
Okay.
That's not, I think it's just
Right.
recording. It's not in the room.
Okay.
That's fine.
Oh,
So
all
we'll
right.
hear from Kelly and then from Rick.
I have a question that was along the lines of what you were just saying. I'm interested to hear about how much of a role the community around the CMSs play in the CMS. How and why, I guess.
Jen.
Well, I don't know anything about WordPress and how the WordPress community works really because I haven't been very involved, but I have noticed there's a couple of really important things in Drupal. The Drupal community is really great about maintaining contributed modules that make your site much better than it is without it. The Drupal community is really bad at making contributed themes. WordPress community is really great at making contributed themes, and I don't know why. And I don't know how like the plugin world is different from Drupal's.
There's good and there's bad.
As with anything. And I find that really interesting where it's like if you want a simple website that's really beautiful, you can buy an affordable theme for WordPress and you can put it on it and you can, have everything you want without just kind of leveraging the community without necessarily needing to hire a developer. And in the Drupal world, you need a developer, and the community is like a support structure for that developer, where they give the developer all the tools they need to do the job. So they're both using communities, I think, in very different ways.
I mean,
Anyone else?
oh, I was going to say something about WordPress.
Go ahead, yeah.
Well, just I don't have. I mean, I think that I think the community is really there, and I actually haven't. I'm not like big in the word camps, but so and if an online community counts, and obviously it does. There's so much. Everybody, there's millions. It feels like there's millions of people developing WordPress sites. So you can type anything into Google, any problem you have as a developer, someone has had before, and you may not always find a good answer, but it also points to like WordPress is much easier as a developer who recently became a developer. It's a really great platform to start developing on because you get this file, functions.php, and like, well, just copy this snippet off the internet and see what it does. And you basically can build your skills out from there. You can also build a total monstrosity that breaks everything. So, but you can learn like little by little how to do it right. And so I found that the WordPress community, whatever that means, is just so much to access that is not, like I started in Drupal and like was intimidated at first, like it's like everything's blue until I had to read. Like
It's incredibly intimidating. I can say, like, I've been working in Drupal for a little over 5 years now, and I went to like 3, like whenever they do the Drupal cons afterwards, they have where you can do core contributions or even work on just modules that you're interested in. And it's so intimidating. It's not unfriendly or anything. It's just like the way that it's structured.
Yeah.
And they're all very nice people. But I mean, I've gone to 3 of these core sessions and never actually committed anything to core. And each time I was like dead set on spending an entire day focusing on nothing but getting a core commit because I thought it would be cool and fun. And I'm already in this fun city, But like, I'll give you another example. Like Al got a patch in 2 days ago on Laravel that he submitted the day before.
Yeah.
And it was like the mod, there's a few people who maintain it, one main guy, and it's just like immediately, it was a good idea, immediately went up, we heard back that day, he requested a few changes, Al did it, got merged in within a day. People say there's downsides to that too, and it's a much smaller community, but it's as a developer who's just interested in doing stuff, like that's a totally different experience. It's awesome.
Yeah, I think all like Laravel, WordPress, Drupal, they all have really good communities, other than GeoCities, sorry. But that's the nice part about all these solutions. You're going to have help. There's a lot of help out there. So.
I think I saw Rick had his hand up earlier.
Comment and a question. The comment is, I think you should use whatever you're really good at. So like, if you're really good at Drupal and someone asks you to build a WordPress site, I don't think you should do it. I think you should spend the time you would have wasted on that getting better at Drupal. And then I had a question for the Laravel guys. Have you done a website that's basically a CMS using Laravel? And if so, why did you do that instead of Drupal?
Yeah, that's a good question. One client, so again, what is a CMS, right? This guy just had a title and a body. He had very little relationships. It was a portfolio site he was selling. He wanted to deploy it hundreds and hundreds of times, just sell it like that, right? So with Laravel, the CK editor we all use or we're used to, and just basic stuff, he had a really good product. He had something he could, just by making a new branch on GitHub, spin up a whole new site for his client, and it did everything he wanted just the way he wanted to. And this was someone who came from a Drupal, his other business he built in Drupal, and he came from, and it wasn't Drupal's fault, but he came from a project that just became more complicated than it needed to be. So it was a good example of that, but it was a very minimal CMS. Title, body, file upload, relate my portfolio to my whatever, yeah, so.
The other thing people don't consider that I think they should more when they consider basically any PHP framework that leverages Composer, which is a package management system that pulls in packages, is you are opening your world up to like everything. Like 99% of the world exists outside of like Drupal. You know, it's like there are so, and I know there's so many cool things that are just like packages that are within minutes you can have them installed and be doing all kinds of cool stuff.
Yeah, so Composer install, and there's this website called Packages, so I could go to Packages and type in blog, and then you would see like the most popular blog plugin for PHP, and it would be like, this got 75,000 downloads, so you kind of get a sense of it's popular, it's doing well. So you just type in Composer install and you would have that for your project. So I didn't even have to build the blog part of that. I could have used that, but you know, I at that time I didn't. Maybe I could do it now and do that and just be even ahead of the game. So.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have 4 minutes until the next.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's too bad we didn't have more time for questions, but we do need time for people to swap and for the next presenter to set up. So thank you everyone on the panel. Thank you all for attending.